time since we actually did a stream, probably 2 months. So we apologize to our esteemed audience because we haven't been here for a while, but we're back. And in fact, with this stream, we're kicking off a number of exciting things that are happening in December. But today we have a very different kind of stream with some really awesome people. Chris and Matthew, I've worked with them before, and the reason why we got them here, and we'll get them to introduce themselves, is because we had a heated, I wouldn't say heated, an argumentative conversation on Twitter about what is the best security approach. So today we're going to be talking about credentials and how you should be dealing with them. And hopefully you'll be part of the conversation. So I'll start with Chris. Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're doing these days, because honestly, I haven't kept tabs on you. Are you still in Cosmos? And then we'll move on to Matthew.
Yeah, sure. So I'm still working on Cosmos. I'm also working across all the Azure databases. So
Nice.
I'm spending time working a lot with Matthew, actually, though not directly with him because I have directs that go and bother Matthew. But we're building a bunch of great functions integration across all the databases. Some cool Logic App stuff we just dropped, VS Code integrations. So all things dev and databases is what I'm doing these days.
Perfect. And Matthew, what about you? Still Azure Functions?
Still Azure Functions, yep.
Love
So mostly just been plugging away on functions. We launched V4 recently, which is a big deal. And then also, I guess, this conversation on Twitter spawned from me sharing some of the stuff that we've done to update a bunch of the extensions to make identity something that you could use for connecting to storage or event hubs and those type of things.
Indeed. So I have to say that I got extremely excited back in March, was it March, when Cosmos DB actually started supporting masked identities. I was like, rock and roll, finally! This is the best. And
It's 2021.
It only took, 5 years to catch up?
We get there eventually.
Sorry, I know. I think there was the last time I spoke about that or talked about that was maybe a year and a half ago, and then it was an internal conversation like, why can we not have it? Like every other service almost has it, and I was told it was about performance and SLAs and making sure that the OIDC thing that happened behind the scenes works flawlessly for people on Cosmos, and I think that the team was working on that. So I'm really happy to see almost every service on Azure supporting it. I think there are a few still there that are trying to get. Yeah, like Matthew's like, yes, there are, and we are going to squash them and make sure that they all support it. But from my perspective, masked identity is probably one of the best things, and there are different ways to obviously access resources. But the Azure SDKs and the identity teams behind all these services have done a fantastic job over the last 2 years to make it seamless and flawless and pretty easy to work with identity. But it's not easy to do identity all the time, right? And I think that's why we're here to talk about it, because I have an approach when I do my development, but other people were like, no, you should be using certificates or you should be doing something else. So maybe we should break it down. Matthew, do you want to tell us a little bit about what are the different options for working with services when it comes to Azure, right? Like what do developers have in their arsenal?
You mentioned like the Azure SDKs, and that's kind of a good encapsulation of it because it shows the different options kind of all at once. It's going to vary by service, but most of the time you're looking at some sort of connection information that's a combination. Like it might be just a connection string, but like if you look inside of those, you'll sometimes see like, okay, here's a key. It's like a shared secret that needs to be rotated or managed or things like that. Sometimes you'll then also have like the locating information, like literally here's the DNS of the thing I'm talking to, and maybe some configuration bits and things like that. So those will be in your classic connection strings, and those have been around for a while. They're pretty well understood. But different services do them slightly differently and all of that. And of course, there's that rotation thing. If you look at services like storage or a few other things, like you can do SAS keys as well, shared access signatures. So you can kind of use basically those credentials to mint types of tokens that will expire on their own, that are scoped to a very particular thing and that sort of thing. That way you can even just create a URL in some situations, which is direct access to, like, say, a blob. So that's another option. And then I think the kind of thing we've been talking about is using an identity. So that's something mapped into Azure Active Directory, some identity that exists in there that you can use and define permissions. There's two different ways that can get projected. So there's a sort of access policy or allow list, where I say, hey, it's this object ID that I'm going to be using. An object ID just being basically the unique identifier for something that's in AAD. So some person, so the three of us each have, an object ID that represents us as a user.
Yep.
And so I can, put that in as say, okay, this is the allow list. And so this service knows that when it sees something come in, check for that. So use the Azure RBAC model. And so this is something that I think people traditionally associate with the management side of Azure, but you can use it for the data plane for a number of services. And so you'll have things like the storage blob data reader role, and that has permissions to access blobs if the given identity has been assigned that role. And so then just attaching a token and throwing that at the service, the SDKs make it really easy to deal with that. But that's sort of a different model of how I would do that connection. I think that's probably most of them. There's probably some other that I'm forgetting, but.
Well, we have the front end, right? So you have front end applications that need to sign in users to get their identity. And then you can also use that approach to do an on behalf of authentication, where you say, like in .NET, we have the Microsoft Identity.web now that allows you to acquire a permission to speak to Azure services without going through the Azure SDK. So the user signs in, it gets a token to speak to an Azure service, and then as long as it has the right permissions, then that request can also go to, say, storage or other services. So that's another approach that doesn't require any authentication. So there's no service-to-service authentication. It's the user, then it passes the access token, and then the application is responsible for passing that access token to the service.
Yeah, I mean, like when we're saying identity, I think it is very easy to key in on people or services, depending on who you're talking to. Like people will kind of gravitate to one of them.
Yep.
But an identity is an identity, and we can kind of work with them the same way. There are some exceptions. Like sometimes you want to know that it's a user sitting on the other side of a service and doing that on behalf of, like, I want to know that it's a token that came from that middle tier, right?
Yep.
There are some times where that would kick in. But yeah, for the most part, it can be either, and that's kind of important. That's an important factor in, like, I think just how people are defining these. And if you get really into the nitty gritty of the AAD side of things, it's also the flows that are getting used, the consent models that might be at play, that sort of thing.
Yes, and I think once you're running on Azure, things are a lot simpler, because as long as there's managed identity support end-to-end, then you don't really have to worry about things, especially with the Azure SDKs doing it flawlessly. Where the challenge came for us, and I think this is where the whole conversation kicked off, was how do I do local development securely before I pass to my application running in QA or a different Azure environment? And this is where the challenge comes, right? Because I love the approach of using a very locked down service principal or service principles that are tied to a specific service. Then I sign into my Azure CLI with that service principal, and then I use that for local development. The Azure SDKs allow you to flawlessly switch between different credential providers. So my choice is always a chain token credential with the Azure CLI locally and the managed identity in production. And that means that whichever account I'm using on my Azure CLI is the one that has access to my production resources. So let's say Cosmos. And in that case, I would say that this account only has read permissions to my Cosmos. Where it gets challenging there is that you can't have multiple credentials, like multiple managed identities, to do read and write. So let's say I want to have a service principal that only does reads, and then I want to have a different service principal that does writes, or have multiple service principals to do multiple services. So you might want to segregate and say that managed identity in production will only be able to speak to Cosmos, and a different managed identity will be able to speak to storage, which provides separation. So this is my approach, but other people had different options. So what about you, Chris? What is your preferred way to secure local development?
Yeah, so like the issue that I've got that oftentimes comes with like service principals for local development, and like we need to kind of somewhat separate local development from like production and kind of like DevOps type of activities, I think, somewhat. But yeah, definitely, Andy, all the time. Basically, I want the identity to represent the person who is doing something. In the database space, one really important thing we use identity for is for auditing. if I delete a stateless service, I'll go recreate it. There's maybe some harm done to the availability of the service, but don't lose data. With data loss, that can be a really big deal, and depending on what your backup times are, you've got RPO issues now, and so that's primarily why the service principles and like proliferation of service principles is, as soon as I've got a service principle that doesn't identify a specific user, I can't truly root cause that it came from someone with using this identity. Then I run into all kinds of debugging problems, and in practice, I've found. I've seen more cases of that exploding out of control than I've seen that end up being successful. When we kind of then get into like the production space, this becomes really critical, and that's where things like JIT permissions for going through there and accessing a resource and using your personal resource. This is important. And the nice thing with JIT is like you can minimally give yourself access to stuff with JIT, and so you still have that lockdown of permissions. You can still avoid potentially giving yourself write access and deleting things when you only meant to read. And so like it's good from a security perspective, it's good from a safety perspective, and really important for me, it's for auditing. Service principles are really difficult to audit. MSI has been great because I don't need to a certain extent, because I know that MSI is kind of being managed by this resource. It's a really hard for that identity to end up on like some machine and outside of Azure talking to us and masquerading as this other service.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I mean, that makes sense. The other option would be to obviously use a dev box on Azure, because that gives you a masked identity that you can use, although that's not an option for everyone.
And in that case, I still need to make sure I know who logged into that dev box, right? With a service, I can lock down a service, but as soon as a human's allowed to then masquerade on behalf of a service, I can run into the same issue where I then have to go through there and try to correlate who was logged on to a machine at the time those requests were issued, and then give them that. And so that process is sometimes called the jump box approach. And it's actually a really great way to get side channel attacks. And so I really like JIT and making people use their identities, because once again, auditing is great, and side channel attacks are still possible, but much more controllable.
Well, and just to make sure we define that, JIT is just in time. The idea there is I only get access when I need it, and then it goes away very quickly. In fact, it probably often requires approvals, conditional access checks, and all that good stuff, which is great, because sometimes you really don't want access to things. Again, side channel attacks.
I've seen this before. Whole organizations using one jump box to do every operation on Azure, which is scary stuff. So what is and I can also use Azure Arc, right? That's another way where you can have a machine like my machine here. It can be Azure Arc joined onto Azure, and I also get a masked identity, which again doesn't help with auditing, but that's another way to pretend I'm in production without really.
Depends on what. So Arc is a broad topic. Depends on what you're referring to and where you're referring to identity. So the cluster has an identity. Like if you're doing a Kubernetes cluster, connected cluster has an identity that it uses to actually facilitate that connection and a few other operations. Doesn't expose those necessarily to your apps.
But Azure Arc domain, so Azure Arc VMs do come with.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. So my box here, if it were to be Azure Arc joined to Azure, it will act and feel and look to Azure as a VM, and therefore it gets its special masked identity. It's not the same exactly, but we work the Azure SDKs team to make it actually flawlessly work. So if you are using the Azure SDKs and you have an Azure Arc joined machine, it can be here on my local environment, it can be on AWS, it can be on Google Cloud, it can be anywhere, as long as not on Azure. You get your masked identity that allows you to do things. But again, it doesn't solve the problem of how do I identify which user did what. So what is
and auditing ends up being the sticky part with all of this stuff, right?
Yes,
as
it is.
soon as humans could potentially use a service's identity and that service misbehaves, like I could tear down this. If I know it, if I'm fairly sure that it's the service's problem, I tear down the service and then we go through there and wait until we can like kind of clean room, figure out what's going on. But if humans are using services identities interchangeably with the service, I have to usually just tear down a lot of stuff to go through there and prevent damage that's actively happening. It's really nice. Part of the value of managed service identity is that sense of least privilege, and so like can just tear them out. And I've done also least privilege also means least damage when I have to go turn something off. So that's usually like a really great best practice. Now, like one thing that can be tricky here that I think we should acknowledge when it comes to like the local dev aspect of things is like constructing what permissions your MSI should have in the first place and testing that locally. That might be good for a one-off service principal for developing that policy, but you then delete the service principal after you're done deving. Like that service principal, I don't like that service principal sticking around. Like I want a service principal to be kind of created and then destroyed. And like I actually know, in theory, if it's not kept around for a long time, it's not going to be something which could be abused over a long period of time. Because what I'm really worried about is a service principal being created, some having the credentials leaked, and then like a year later being used for a side channel attack. So if that service principal doesn't exist for more than 30 days, then the chances of that long-term harm are removed.
So there are, sorry, go on, Matthew.
What I was going to just call it, your workflow there sounds much more sophisticated than what you get out of the box too, right?
Yep.
Like I rolled my eyes slightly when you said manage identity least privilege because, oh boy, have I seen some things.
Contributor to the whole subscription.
Yeah, no, seriously, people do this all the time. They bloat it out or they use a user-assigned identity that they then share across resources, which means you're also taking the union of their permissions needs and exposing them like everything. Like that's really an anti-pattern.
If I had it my way, I would go through there and make MSI unable to have assigned roles. It would always have to have manual permissions added to it each time, one by one, because that would ensure that we do least privilege. I know this is a balancing act. I myself have features that I don't enable by default that would make things more secure because we want people to onboard. And it's one of those things where you're kind of defending against really worst case scenarios. And so it is a balance. Like, security is constantly having to balance productivity a lot of times. And that's probably where this like giving a role to an MSI comes in. So
if I remember correctly, if you create an MSI in the portal, it doesn't have any permissions. So, you create an MSI, not a system, a resource assigned one, right? So system assigned for, say, a web app. I think that comes with nothing. You have to go to the resource that you want to access and add the permissions there. Yes. Where the problem comes is when you programmatically do it. And as we know, especially with service principals, the default behavior up until now was, Azure AD SP create and then create for RBAC, if I remember correctly, and then it would give you contributor rights to the whole subscription by default. This is actually changing. So if you were used to running that command, then the idea there is that you definitely need to provide a scope and you definitely need to provide a role, which the contributor is now gone, which is perfect. But I was going to say, if you are brave enough, just go and run AZAD show mine and see how many service principals you have still sticking around. Because I ran it the other day. John Gallen put a nice script out there, and oh my God, the amount of Azure CLI SPs that I have hanging around is scary. And I don't delete them now because
service principals need to be treated like certs, and they need to be rotated on a regular cadence. Like we've got a policy which is like 90 days. We rotate them every 45 days. Nice. You've got to do that because that prevents like leaking of those service principals to go through there and be used for long-term attacks. But two, when you do need to rotate, you can rotate. And that's the same thing with certs, right? If you don't rotate your certs on a frequent basis, you don't know if you can rotate your cert when you need to. So it's much better to practice rotating your service principals than it is to hope you can do it later.
It's a fire drill. And most of the time in this industry, we mean that as, oh goodness, we have to go scramble to do something. But no, in the spirit of, we want to make sure that everybody knows how this works.
Far better that you put that effort up front than you get to go through there and ruin your team's weekend because you're trying to go through there and find all the places where you screwed this up because you didn't rotate your service principals on a regular basis the last 2 years. And oh no, it turns out there's a blog post about how someone's been using that thing for sustained access. That's terrible. You don't want to find out that way.
Yeah. So the other option to use service principal, if you I know that in some cases we have to pass service principal credentials in the application. If I remember correctly, I had to use a service principal to sign into Azure AD to get some permissions for users. And that requires to do client credential authentication flow because it's a service to service. For that, I actually stack the secret in Key Vault. So my code would go and first fetch the secret from Key Vault using managed identity, using a lockdown service principal that only had access to that Key Vault and only for reading keys. And it will pull that key across and pass that into further down the flow. That's another option, but it involves like more complex architecture when you try to do simple things. But security does come with comes with the price to pay, right? The more it requires a little bit more involved architecture.
Well, it involves the architectural side of things, but I think one of the points of a lot of the motions, the changes around here are to remove some of the operational complexity there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the easiest secret to manage is the secret that doesn't exist.
Yep.
And like that's why we want to just move it all to identities that we don't have to exist.
Yeah.
So it makes it so that there's a lot more yes, you're controlling permissions, and your permissions architecture always needs to be good. That doesn't necessarily change. But there's this notion of, well, I have to do this rotation. I have to do X, Y, Z, and that's where it's preferred. Like, if you absolutely positively need a secret, yes, take it, throw it in Key Vault, control access to Key Vault using an identity. That's great. But for most services in Azure, as they're adopting these identity-based solutions, that's much preferable, at least to me.
Yeah.
Because I'll gladly take the trade-off of the extra step of doing a role assignment for not ever having to think about that connection again.
Yes.
In terms of the secret part of it. Obviously permissions auditing and all that good stuff. But yeah.
That's right. I mean, worst case scenario, you can dump everything into Key Vault, and since Key Vault has mass identity support, you can use that to pull the secrets across. But you're right. The less identities we have to use, the easier it is, because mass identity doesn't require you to have any secrets. It rotates it does secret rotation automatically behind the scenes, so you never ever have to know if things have changed. And it has allocated RBAC roles. We do have a question from the audience, although it's slightly related, slightly unrelated. So Danny is Inodan L? I don't know. I'm not. Yeah, Inodanel. He says, I don't understand how Azure Function Auth works if bundled with a static web app.
This is the managed functions versus non-managed functions issues, Matt.
Yes, it is different between those technically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one thing that's worth understanding on this is that managed functions is not technically running inside of your subscription is effectively the problem. And so there's this kind of on behalf of MSI thing that's still getting worked through. When you're doing bring your own functions, it is functions just running in your regular subscription, and so MSI just works as is. So if you want MSI identity stuff to work like it works for functions normally, just do bring your own functions with static web apps, and in the meantime you're left kind of with the old approach of going through there and using a service principal or reaching out to Key Vault and using some of those pieces.
Yeah, right. And if in some cases, if you want to run through with your own code, you can do some of that delegated access, so on behalf of type things or client credentials, you can make some of those things work. But it's definitely a lot more control when you have the function app directly visible, full config control over it. Yeah.
Nice. So we haven't managed to answer the question, how do I, if I am developing locally, and let's say I have a web app that needs to access a storage and a database and maybe other services. Ideally, we want to segregate the permissions across these, so we don't want to have one account that has access to everything, right? Because that's more privileged than we would like to.
When you're doing local development, I would argue
doesn't matter.
Not a big deal. If you unless you've got some interesting system where in your dev environment your users aren't be able to create and manage the resources themselves, and so you're kind of having to lock people down in weird ways that way. The person who's writing the code on their machine has access to those things. Whether you create another identity to give them access or they use their personal identity,
True.
It's the same kind of barrier of access.
No, it's not.
Exactly.
And I think it's the opposite thing, though. Go ahead.
I'm about to get told, is what I'm saying. You guys both jumped on me at the same time.
I think we're about to say the exact opposite thing, so go Christos.
Well, so let's say on my Visual Studio and my Visual Studio Code, I'm signed in with my corporate credentials, right? And they give me access to my Azure subscription where I am either an owner or a contributor. So when I develop, if I say grab the credentials from Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio, then those credentials are going to be a lot more privileged than actually pushing down a service principal. So you said earlier on, it's nice to test your service principal with the lockdown permissions because that's a good example of how it works in production. The only challenge there is that, let's say if you are using user-assigned identities, right? So you say, I want to create my managed identities that I own and operate, not as part of the resource. Then in your code, you can pass the ID of that. So you can say, I want my credential for storage to use that specific managed identity, but I want my credential for my Cosmos to use a different credential. And that's something that we cannot replicate on the local environment unless you actually mess up with your code. So
my argument here is that you actually have, it's the reverse because you are correct. Like you do have the effective permissions of everything. The point of that testing, though, is integration testing, which is not what I'm doing locally. What I'm doing locally is mostly going to be unit testing. It's testing that compute component and things like that. So it is a different layer in my mind. And so, like, I don't think it has to be as refined there. It is scary, though, if I don't trust that code, right?
Yeah.
And that's the key detail is you want to be running trusted code. I actually really love the fact that VS Code added all that stuff for like, hey, are you sure that this folder or like this thing you downloaded, it puts you in read-only mode before it even lets you do anything in there. And I love that. Sorry, go ahead, Chris. You look like
I was going to say, if you're running untrusted code, that's actually a great use case of the Azure VM with an MSI and like locking down what the MSI is allowed to do. You could even give it no permissions and then audit all the stuff it requests access to, because you'll see a whole bunch of denials in your audit logs for what they were trying to access in the first place. So
nice.
That's a great place for using VM because you can throw the VM away. If you don't trust that code, it's not just a matter of not trusting what it's going to do in Azure. I mean, that thing could leave all kinds of crap behind it.
Yes.
So if you're going to run untrusted code, put it on something you can throw away and something that you can kind of audit what it tried to access.
Yeah, I actually don't know the story here. I'd be curious to find out, but like with code spaces, I don't know if things like default Azure credential would run right away, but I hope not. That seems like it would be a scary situation. I guess you'd have to already log into the Azure extension and everything, but that's sort of an interesting question.
Does it load all your?
Again, I don't know. I'd have to go try it, but
I think you still need to sign in, right? Because
there would be a sign-in action, but I guess my point is that like, it's much easier than it used to be to start trying stuff out, and I guess that's a interesting consideration because like it is that ephemeral VM, but it is running in your context potentially. So that's sort of an interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Yeah, like if you're doing a kind of ephemeral VM, like in theory, you're doing something there where like once again that VM's not long lived. What I'm not a fan of is long lived service principals. So like if you're gonna do a service principal, create it and then get rid of it as soon as you can get rid of it, and then that's gonna reduce the possibility that a service principal that you created 6 months ago gets used on something that you don't remember it getting used on, and now you're in the mode of like, oh crap, who got access to this identity that I created? I'm responsible for it, but you've now lost control.
I mean, so why do we have things like secrets management? Because unmanaged secrets get places. They get checked in. They get shared to people. Be like, oh well, the new guy on the team is ramping up, and I'll just throw him the cert or whatever. Like these things absolutely happen, right? And so. Again, get rid of it. Like we're serverless folk here, right? Like like we like owning less. Let me just work on the thing and not have to actually deal with some other artifact.
Credentialless. There we go.
Credentialless.
Yeah, 100%. Oh, it's sometimes you'll hear in the offices. Sometimes we'll bandy around the term secretless, serverless, but like, oh boy, that gets misused too. Because I mean, the secrets can still exist, right? There's still other things that I would need to talk to, right? If I need to go talk to an external service, like, outside of the Azure context, that might be my only option. Great, put it in Key Vault, make it manage, use it, that sort of thing.
Rotate it.
Our friend has a question about auth, which I think is interesting. So like this one's not about MSI and kind of the thing, but this speaks to the kind of the on behalf of piece maybe a little bit. So what you're kind of going to deal with inside of static web apps and like functions running inside of static web apps, whether or not you're talking about on behalf of functions or bring your own functions. Like how you do authentication of the kind of front end is really up to you. And there's a couple of ways you can do it, but the easiest way of doing it is using the app service authentication and authorization feature, of which Hendo is responsible for. We can blame him. It's a great feature.
It's starting point, right? And then goes all the way.
It works really great for lots of scenarios, because even if like I said, you can use it as a starting point. You can add other things. I think you've got OpenID support in there now, right, Matthew?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it can be your ending point too. Like the real trick is that generally you're going to be handling authorization logic inside of your app, and so like the kind of starting point is you bounce everyone who's unauthenticated, and that's your simple auth. What you want to do is have an authorization inside of your app. So like what you're going to do is if you enable easy authentication or app service authentication, we call it easy auth. On your static web app, that's going to pass a credential along on a header. If you read the documentation on this stuff, it'll kind of explain the header name. In .NET, that should just get picked up and automatically flowed through. But if you truly don't see it for some reason, something's misconfigured, as a last resort, you go through there and you look for the header name that's described. This is what you would do in like the Node.js functions or Python functions. But on .NET, that should be flowed through properly. You get
a claims principle that has
but his point is that if he's using .NET 6, he doesn't have the library to hydrate it from there. So
yes. Yeah, I don't know what the .NET 6 version of this is yet. So that's
a conversation.
It is a conversation. It's evolving.
In .NET 6 right now, you just go look at the header. Just like you do in all the other languages, go look in the header, and you use the information in the header, the header, to go through there and make your authorization decisions. The nice thing with app service authentication is you can trust that JOT is validated. So all you're trying to do is actually grab the information inside the JOT. Mm-hmm. You don't need to bother with all the hard steps of what is the right way to validate a JOT, which is a very tricky thing sometimes.
Yeah, so Alex86, you don't really, I don't know if he's pointing to us, but it's okay. What I have to say that if you are using an identity service provider, whether it's Azure Active Directory or a different service, third-party service, when the user signs in, there's a number of claims that come back as part of that JWT. In most libraries, in most major frameworks, you don't really need to understand how JWTs work. Usually there's a library that will translate these and dump them into roles or permissions, and then you can use that information to do your authorization. So in O'Donnell, it's different from MSI, but once your user signs in, that JWT information will have hopefully everything it needs for you to be able to make decisions about how it needs to access, what it can access, and how to move forward. Or if you want to give them a 403 because they're unauthorized.
Yeah. And that's where that on behalf of piece becomes interesting, right? Because if you are using AAD as your identity provider, you can do on behalf of, in theory, as a part of your service. It makes sense for a lot of like line of business and some other apps. Mm-hmm. You probably won't find that it makes sense for your B2C apps. And that's where like you would go through there and have to write your authorization logic to use the identity to talk to most services in Azure. There's some services that can actually support some B2C stuff, but
in some cases it's it's just as well to just use a service to service on that layer as well. If you don't, this is where it gets tricky. It ties into the auditing question or even access permissions question. But let's say that you're doing something with the Microsoft Graph and you're doing webhooks from there, right? Most of the time, your webhook handler is actually going to be using a app principle of some kind and talking to the graph as itself, because SharePoint calls you and it doesn't provide you with a user context other than this was the event and that sort of thing. You won't have that user's token. You probably shouldn't have been holding on to it, really. I mean, if you did, you're dealing with the refresh life cycle and all that stuff. Like, there's just one example. The point is, like, those on behalf of, they're really nice when they make sense. But sometimes it is preferable, I guess, to do the just app layer. I just wanted to call that out because it's something I've seen people bash their head at for a while before switching just to app.
I do find that the on behalf of is an optimization. I tend to find that it's an optimization to add in later rather than something that I'm going to start with. It's a pretty big thing to figure out how to get it working. Like, I use it when it's necessary, not as a first step.
Yeah, so the only challenge with Azure AD authentication and on behalf of is that it doesn't support all the services. So there are certain services that will not allow you to do on behalf of. And it's a little bit of a blank because it's like access as user, if I remember correctly. Or no, it's user impersonation when you get that. So technically...
Well, that claim is not necessarily standard, right? So it is a convention from V1 registrations in AAD in many cases, but it is not guaranteed. And if you're using the V2 model, there's some interesting differences in terms of how like the combined consent and delegated access flows work, and when you actually are managing to get scopes that apply to the you're actually able to get permissions that apply to the downstream resource.
Yep, that's right. So it's not perfect, but it's getting there, right? And if you want to see more support, then please let us know, because this is how we get that feedback back to the product team and say, a lot more people want to do user impersonation and they want to access resources through front end doors rather than using service to service authentication. But the challenge is to know what to use and when to use it. And there's a lot of information out there. It's really complex, and it also comes down to your scenarios, right? So that's why it's hard for us to produce documentation that applies to everyone, because every solution out there is fairly unique in terms of the security requirements, which provides a challenge.
But I think listening to this stuff, it seems like it's okay to use your identity when you're developing your app and you're not worrying about trying to get the permissions right fit that you would be worrying about to configure your role. When you're trying to figure out how to configure your role, creating a service principal to go through there and get the permissions right makes a lot of sense. Make sure you've got integration testing that actually goes through there and tests this stuff, so you're not finding out about issues in weird ways. And delete any service principals you do create on a regular basis.
And let's go unsaid, please, your local development does not talk to production resources ever.
Yes.
Never ever.
And a dev subscription is highly recommended when you do testing like that. I know it's hard to do, but technically all of our accounts should not have access to production subscriptions. I've seen people deleting databases by mistake because they're like, oh, I thought I was in my QA and suddenly I deleted, or my dev environment, I deleted the production databases. So ideally, the way that your company is structured is that you should not have access to production unless you are deemed that you should have access. And then that should be a just in time, as we talked earlier on. Even IT admins, we used break glass approach, where there was a physical safe that people had to go in and open it and then get the glass, break it, and then provide access to IT admins, because either maliciously or by mistake, people do stuff in production systems. We've seen systems being taken down because somebody deleted a service principal they shouldn't have, or somebody forgot to roll, or renew an SSL certificate, or somebody just wiped a resource by mistake, or they get fired and somebody forgets to remove their access, and suddenly they go back to their desk and cause all sorts of damage. I've been in companies where people had access to production systems 2 or 3 years after they left that company because nobody rolled their credentials. Nobody
their certs that they had on their box for talking to resources from local.
Yeah, it's just scary, right? So
this is why we have a practice of not even using the same identity for production and dev, right? That helps you avoid accidentally somehow having your dev accounts have the same permission, having sustained permissions on prod. And so even when you do make that mistake on prod of giving sustained permissions, it should be difficult to accidentally think you were on dev. And so anything you can do to kind of keep that firewall. Humans don't belong on prod is a really thing that we should all strive towards, not only because of good security practices, but oftentimes it means lower support costs for us. If we can go through there and automate things in production, it means that we're not relying on human labor to solve things. I know that's idealized. It's really hard to get to no humans touching production for some situations. It might not make economic sense for some teams to go through there and really worry about that engineering. But that's the dream, man. That is a place we'd all love to be, is that no human logs into a production system ever.
Yeah, and then your DevOps pipelines also follow the same principles in terms of least privilege and what they can do and how much damage they can do, because that can also be another attack vector where somebody, rather than hijacking your code, they will hijack the release pipelines and then they can do things. I think there was an issue maybe 6-7 months ago on GitHub where somebody could actually execute privileged commands and hijack actions by sending a malicious pull request into your repo. So you can see like people will try to find all sorts of different ways to hijack, and then if your pipelines are running with an extremely privileged account, because again, if you're on GitHub, for example, you need to provide a service principal, although that's changing.
Yeah, no, I was about to say that is no longer the case, my friend.
So exciting, right? We actually have proper OIDC support, so OpenID Connect support in Azure GitHub. We'll probably need to do an episode on this one just to show people how to leverage that. John Gallen actually put a fantastic video out there explaining how it works. But coming back to service principals, I think one of your tasks in your pipelines should be either going and rolling passwords in your service principals and see what breaks, or deleting them if they're over than 6 months and you don't know what they're doing, right? So,
and I would say like, it's way better to just delete the entire service principal than just rotate the secrets. Like,
True.
It's you can guarantee that the password is just floating around somewhere. And like oftentimes, if you're going through there and rotating credentials, it's easier to just rotate the identity than it is to rotate the actual credentials on that identity. And so, because it's very similar to
the permissions model is like, because those assignments are not implicit, right? The thing about a service principal is that you rotate the certain things like that, but like the permission that has been granted to the principal in general sticks.
Yeah,
right?
That's also a good case. You can have it's config drift, right? You can have config drift on a service principal by deleting and recreating that service principal. You also avoid config drift in addition to potentially credentials issues.
Yep.
Config drift is really fun. Delete all your production and recreate it every 90 days. There we go. Then you avoid all issues.
I love your confidence, man. I love your confidence. I don't think I've met many people that in many companies I work with that they will have the confidence to recreate their environment from scratch and be confident that everything would work out of the box.
Here's a fun thought experiment. Take a subscription to 0. Take it all the way back.
Okay.
The thing that you'll run into is there's a lot of hidden things that are lying around because some of your things are actually not in the subscription. And this is one of the reasons I don't like service principals in terms of compared to identity for local, because that lives in AAD.
Right.
And if you look at the way the parent-child relationship works here, a subscription is within an Azure Active Directory, not the other way around.
Correct.
So it is something that lives outside the realm of that subscription. I can't just delete it. Like if I'm setting up a set of test resources, okay, let's say I put those in a resource group. Fine. I can delete the resource group. Great. Yep. Principal still exists. And if it was talking to other things, then that's still out there. Like, and it's one of those things I don't have as direct management of, and it frankly doesn't feel obvious. And so this is one of those things for me that's just like, if I can avoid having externalities to the deployment, I absolutely will. And the nice thing is the role assignments, at least, are technically, depending on your scope, but they're parented under that scope, meaning that it's called an extension resource. So like storage account, I'm getting access to that storage account. The role assignment scope is that resource. It's actually, if you look at it, it exists underneath of that resource. When that resource goes away, that role assignment is cleaned up. You can end up with dangling assignments, though, if they're like subscription level, and that sort of thing.
And ideally, you shouldn't have many subscription level permissions, especially for service principals. Please don't do that. And if you are in the habit of doing it, please don't. I like either resource group or resource within the resource group if it's very specific about the operations. But sometimes you need to create one for deploying, right? So that's service principal.
And
back in the day,
it's if it doesn't work, this doesn't work for everyone. But like creating subscriptions for different environments, even potentially different geos. So like creating a subscription if you've got different that geo thing can also be really good for helping with some data sovereignty stuff, but it's just like having the isolation could be nice. Eno's got a good point in the chat here about being able to delete and recreate everything from scratch is a good way of testing that you don't have these externalities, but it's also a good way of dealing with let's say you've got someone trying to do a ransom of your service. You can just if you can just spin it up again. You got to wait for the DNS records to point somewhere else, and that can sometimes be tricky. But broadly, that puts you in a place where you can act with a lot more confidence, and that's nice.
Yeah, so now we're moving into the realm of, and you're doing databases. So it's not just the resources that you need to manage well, it's it's the data that you need to manage well, and also have confidence that you can restore that data when the resources come back up. So, and secure them properly, please. Don't dump
data,
backups into...
Data can be the stickiest part of all this, because like we do a really good job on a lot of the managed databases of like having point in time restore within that environment. Yep. But then you take that data and you like ETL it entirely out of the system, like you're gonna definitely increase your RTO if you're trying to go through there and recover from a external backup versus a kind of integrated backup. So make sure that when you're thinking about your RTO times and things along those lines, you've got RTO for specific scenarios in mind. A database going down is different from the entire service needing to be restarted from scratch, and your kind of requirements there are going to be based off of the risk profile that you've got and what your customers expect and all those different pieces. It costs money to have RTO get lowered, because you're generally working about like, if you really need to have low RTO in this scenario, you're oftentimes running a secondary passive environment. That's really the only way of kind of lowering RTO past usually the time it takes to load all that data back into Azure.
So yeah, because back in the day, like many years ago, I'm talking about data, RTO and all that, I used to work for a company that aggregated a lot of data. And then back then 1.5 terabyte was a lot of data, which is not the case. But we got to the point that deployments would take whole weekends, and then we had to have a specific time of cutoff, because if past Saturday, say 1 p.m., there will be no chance for us to be back online for the Monday open of business. So if that is the case for you, then there are scenarios where you need to start thinking about how can I segregate my data and have the most recent data in hot standby, and then all their archival data in cold standby, which means that your archival process and your restore process will be very different, rather than trying to dump everything into one database. So, but again, it comes down to your scenarios. I don't think 1.5 terabyte today is anything big or anything substantial. We carry this on our phones.
Big enough you should think about it, but it's not specialized skill set. Kind of think about it.
True. Yeah. Cool. So that was interesting. I think we have a few more minutes if we want to wrap it up. I think it was very interesting talking to you about this thing.
I feel like our intervention isn't complete, Christos. We convince you that you really need to be using the user identities here.
So what should I be using? Tell me.
If you're going to use service principals, I want you to create and delete the service principal every time you use it. So like every day, if you're going to bring it onto your local machine, I want you to end your workday by deleting that service principal.
So I need to have a scheduled task that runs a PowerShell script or an Azure CLI script.
If you want to do it that way, that's fine.
Well, hold on. But how's that PowerShell script authenticating? Hold on.
Yeah.
Oh, damn. I got caught again.
Yeah. But also, like, to that end, right? Like, you have to have permissions at all to do those things in AAD. Not everybody is going to have permission to create a service principal. Role assignments, much more straightforward. If you created the resource, you probably have permissions to assign roles, to assign data access to it. So that's another advantage here, is that like that standardization helps control. If you're thinking from like your identity control point perspective, it allows you to have things a little bit more locked down there. So I do think that's an advantage of that pattern organizationally.
Short of some scenarios where you're having to talk to Azure from a system that doesn't have MSI like itself. So if you're trying to talk to Azure from outside of Azure, I would say you could probably get away with never using a service principal. Like local development, you're using local dev. Service principal can help with debugging things locally on some of your permission setups. So like it might be a useful thing as a debugging tool.
Sure.
But your integration stuff should be able to use MSI. And so like in theory, after you've kind of gotten your template working, service principals don't need to be a normal part of your workflow. It's a great way of avoiding, just the same way I would today, if I saw someone creating certs as a regular part of their workflow, I'd be like, ooh, you probably shouldn't do that. I think of service principals the same way I think of certs. They're credentials that will leak eventually, given enough time, and that is an issue.
So what about hybrid scenarios? Because right now we talked about either local dev or prod, but what about systems that run on-prem because they can't be moved to Azure yet? and then they have to access
that
Azure
scenario
resources.
where something needs to talk to Azure from outside of Azure.
Yeah.
That's a service principal or a cert. I mean, like ultimately they've got the same problem, which is that it is something that is not auto expiring. And so you have to have a practice which automatically rotates. And when a cert or a service principal has been alive for longer than the time that you said it's supposed to be alive, it needs to be treated as a serious security incident within your team. It is not something that you just let build up debt, because it just takes once for someone to go through there and snag those things. And like, I know red teams love it when they find like a long-lived service principal. They're just as easy as a long-lived cert to go through there and find side channels with. True.
So I found the solution to my problem. I'm going to create an Azure notebook that will automatically run the tasks for me in the cloud, and it will authenticate using masked identities.
Yeah, if you want to on your using your credentials, create a service principal as a way of doing local integration testing.
Yeah.
And part of the local integration test is to delete the service principal at the end.
Yeah. There you go.
I won't be upset.
I'll still be a little upset.
I mean, a little bit, but.
Okay, well, give me a better solution.
I mean, you use an identity, and you keep it scoped. Like use your actual user identity for that level of interaction. It should be scoped. It shouldn't have access to anything. When you're dealing with more sensitive environments where you need to do that, then obviously we would have like a managed identity or those types of things. But like, to me, it's a matter of like it's fallback. Like, okay, what do I want to do? I want a managed identity. Well, I can't have that because I'm sitting on my local box. I'll use my identity. Well, I can't have that for XYZ reason. Okay, well then we can do it. Like service principal is like the line of last resort in my mind. Like we at that point we've accepted a certain level of compromise, and that is the principle that I want to adhere to. So for me, like there's absolutely good reasons to do it. I'm not saying never, but I'm saying that like I don't want it to be sort of the like built-in assumption.
Right.
Yeah.
The longer that service principal is alive, the higher the risk that it has been leaked, right?
Yep.
And so that time starts at minute 0, right? And so like rotating at 90 days is, something that is like, okay, this is a good way of at least preventing long-term damage. But if it was a really sensitive system, I might rotate the secret every day. It really depends on what you're trying to protect. And ultimately, if I'm trying to do something really secret, I'm going to go through there and trust MSI, because MSI removes a lot of these problems in the first place. And speaking to he has a comment here about at the end of the day, all the passwords go into a spreadsheet on the network drive. This is why you go passwordless, right? If I can go through there and just use my phone to log into the thing, granted my phone's using my face or whatever, it's like eventually there's some kind of password somewhere. Like I got that for my users. MSI, there's no password for MSI. That's being automatically managed for you by Azure. I can avoid having passwords stored anywhere these days, and I would definitely recommend people get to it. Get yourself a YubiKey. Like, just do something to avoid passwords in your life, because passwords are debt. Anything that's a secret needs to be rotated automatically.
I heard a very interesting quote the other day. Hackers do not break in; they sign in.
Yeah, exactly.
They will hand GitHub and every other place that they can find credentials, and they will try to sign in with those credentials, because it's a lot easier to do that rather than trying to break the operating system or hack the browser or hack the app. Because they will still try to do that, but if they can find a login to your app, there's no point of them trying. Right? So social engineering is where it comes into sometimes, right? Or phishing attacks. Get somebody's credentials.
Like 0 days are expensive, right?
Yes.
So you're going to use a 0 day for something that's worth it usually. Like even if I was probing a system casually for something, if I found a 0 day, you're probably gonna make more money for the average hacker by selling the 0 day than actually using it yourself. So 0 days are rare and they're expensive.
Or bug bounty program. Bug bounty programs exist.
What color is your hat? Yeah.
Yeah. If you're casually browsing, you find something, I would hope that is.
Mine's gray. What's that mean?
Yeah.
It is. Well, that has been very educational and very interesting to have you on the show. I think we should do it again. And I appreciate all your input and your ideas. I think people walking out of this one will have picked up something. I'm definitely going to write a script to delete my service principals. And if it breaks systems, it breaks systems. At least I will know what's broken, because I have the fear of God for all the service principals I have out there. And yeah.
It's okay to break once, just don't break a second time, right? That's usually the rule.
And disclosure, nothing is a production system that will affect other people. It's just my proof of concepts and random stuff that I've written over time.
Just call it chaos engineering, and then you're good.
I will call you guys. You know what you're doing.
At the moment, we're all PMs, so they don't trust us with anything production, anyways, right?
So we don't trust anyone. Don't trust anyone.
I do have a saw, so in theory, I could do custom.
Yeah, let's just say you can absolutely do it, but I have worked very hard to make it so that I do not have access to things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a core perk of my job right now.
Oh, somebody says, can you please explain what is a service principal? I can take a stab at that.
Yeah,
or Chris,
please.
you can go.
No, it's all you, Mr. Identity.
It's a service account for the cloud. Like back in the good old days of having your domains in your on-prem environment, you had your system accounts and privileged accounts that could run certain tasks. In the cloud, you don't really have a domain. Everything is disparate and everything is standalone. So one way to allow inter-service communications by creating a service principal, a service account for the cloud, in other words, that can execute certain things, and you can lock it down with certain permissions and privileges, and ideally least privilege is the best way to go. I hope I explained that well.
It's more or less just a artificial identity. That is intended to be used by a service, hence service principal. The challenge with service principals is that you can't necessarily always enforce that it's being used by a service and not a human who's making the service do stuff. And that is my problem with service principals, is that they almost trick you into believing that it's a service. Knowing that it's a service or not is really up to your trust of the isolation of your environment. So
yeah.
The auditing really does matter, and it's in a lot more places than I think people realize. Set up diagnostic logs on your storage queues. Go take a look at just what the queries are. There's the authentication type. It'll show you whether or not it's using an account key or OAuth, and then you can actually see the object ID of the resource. I actually found a bug yesterday just by doing this, because I noticed that all of a sudden it was an object ID I didn't expect. And so I found out that actually a different identity was getting used than the one I'd intended. Not the end of the world in that situation. Could be an important thing to notice. So like these types of things, like it is helpful when you can go and say, yeah, that was Chris, versus, this was some service principal that I don't know where it is.
Where it's running from, how it's running, and who's signing in as that account. There you go.
This is actually my first job here at Microsoft, was going through there and chasing after people who logged into production and getting them to go through there and fill in their freaking thing to say what they did access production for. And then, of course, looking for people who left behind an environment that was in a different state than when they accessed it in the first place. Like, what'd you do there? So that was my very first job here before I went and hung out with Matthew over on mobile services. Yeah. Fun story, by the way. My favorite story about Matthew is I don't know if you still have it, but for the longest time, he had the OAuth 2.0 spec on his desk. That's one of the first conversations we had when I first met him, was he had the OAuth 2.0 spec on his desktop.
And I referenced it when I was arguing with people.
It was dog-eared. It was a well-used piece of paper.
Hey, that is a great discussion opener, conversation opener for, hey, I see you got the RFC here. Let's talk about it. That's how we're all in bars.
I think at the time I was like, OAuth 2. I think I heard about that when I was trying to use Passport.js. I think that was about as far as I'd ever gotten with identity back then.
Passport.js. We actually have an MSL node now, so no need to use Passport.js anymore.
I mean, if I'm trying to go through there and also potentially use other login providers, I would still probably use Passport.js.
True.
Also, is IntelliJS, is it acting like in the same way that MSL.NET is not Microsoft Identity Web? Because I think of Passport as more analogous to Microsoft Identity Web.
It is. Yeah. So sorry, I should take that back. We have half of the solution built, so you can acquire tokens with MSL node, but you can do sign-ins, but it's a bit of a weird experience.
Passport can be a little bit of an overkill depending on what you're. If you're only trying to support login for AAD, I would probably just use MSL directly. But if I was trying to do multi-auth, Passport's a pretty good solution out of the box if I don't want to build one myself at the moment.
Indeed. But you use the library that you like and you're more comfortable with, and we will make it happen.
My favorite is Service Authentication. Saves me time all the time. I hate having to go through there and actually build the authentication stuff into my code. I use that feature on app service more than anything.
Look at the smile in Matthew's face.
Yeah. My heart grew 3 sizes this day. Oh man.
His most loyal customer.
Yeah. I mean, after all we've been through together, yeah, I hope. I guess we didn't set the context that Chris and I worked together a lot on functions in particular.
Yes, that's where I met Chris as well, when he was in functions.
That's when I caused the most trouble for the world.
You did.
And the most good, probably.
I do have a funny story from meeting you, Chris, because it was back.
I could have stopped input-output bindings, so that's I walked away with that sin on my soul. So.
Oh.
So for people that don't know, Chris is an avid JavaScript developer. So I was working with Ghost, the blogging engine, and I did put a blog post out there saying how I was deploying my Ghost blog to Azure. And I think I had to chat with you because I was blocked somewhere. And at the end of the conversation, we're like, why are you deploying like that? You could be using GitHub hooks to your Azure. I was like, oh, I didn't think about that. So I hung up and I spent a couple of hours doing it. And it worked. It worked flawlessly. Everything was perfect. I put it on GitHub. And I woke up the next morning and I had an email from SendGrid saying I had 30,000 emails sent out overnight. I'm like, yes, I went viral. Obviously, what I didn't pay attention to when I was doing that is I pushed my GitHub to public. So my GitHub repo was public, and I pushed my secrets to my SendGrid onto the public repo. Hence, a great story to talk about security, where my secrets to my API were inside my config file. And somebody picked it up straight away and then started using my account to send 30,000 emails out.
And this is why we use .env.
That's why I don't use public repos anymore.
That is awesome. That is awesome.
Yeah.
Really great. Thank you, GitHub, for free private repos. You've saved
Yeah,
a lot of trouble.
Thank you. Like that. Please don't do it. Don't check in your secrets into code.
And use .env and save yourself a lot of trouble.
Yep. So I want to thank my 2 esteemed guests today. I realized that I went as Stefan today on the stream because I forgot to change the name. That's fine. It's fine. Everybody loves Stefan, so no harm done. And we are going to be back with another stream on the 3rd of December. So we're taking a break over the holidays next week. Are you guys taking time off?
This is the last thing I'm doing.
You are.
And then I'm not going to be here until 2021 or 2022.
What year is it?
We're not doing the same year over again, man. I can't afford another 2021. Trust me.
It's a little Groundhog's Day, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Still March, right? But yeah, what about you, Matthew? Are you doing anything fun?
A little time, so probably not as much as I want, but I had a million weddings to deal with recently, so I'm all out of vacation.
I've got 105 hours I'm going to lose this year.
130. I beat you.
Nice. Look at that.
I don't have any friends that are getting married like Matthew, or I don't have any friends. So.
Oh, we don't have any friends. It's fine. It's easier. It's cheaper, actually. You don't have to buy presents, right?
No, I only love JavaScript. It's my only friend.
And your wife.
And
occasionally, yeah.
Yeah. JavaScript.
I talk to her about JavaScript sometimes.
Right. Well, I appreciate everyone coming, and I appreciate the questions from our audience. This is going to be on YouTube, so you guys can watch it afterwards. If you had any questions, make sure to join us on Discord. We have a fantastic channel there and a fantastic community. Stay safe, everyone. Have a nice weekend, and we will see you soon. Take it easy.
Happy Turkey Day. Bye.
Take care. Bye.